Hello, everybody. I'm Michelle Stein, and on behalf of Protect Our Waterways, No Nuclear Waste, we'd like to thank everybody for joining us this evening. I just want to share real quick who we are. Protect Our Waterways is a group of individuals who were shocked to learn at the end of January that the Nuclear Waste Management Organization had purchased and optioned 1,300 acres of farmland in our community. They want to bury all of Canada's radioactive nuclear spent fuel rods, and nobody had ever asked us if we wanted this project. We are youth who want to protect the river they fish in, the forest they hunt in, and the dreams they have of carrying on their family's farm. We are young families who chose to live here because they wanted a quiet, safe place to raise their children and enjoy the outdoors. We are people who moved here for their retirement to live in a peaceful, beautiful community and every age in between. We are engineers, teachers, farmers, professors, tradespeople, doctors, business owners, painters, builders, nurses, parents, grandparents, and we're from every part of the community, all with the common goal of protecting our families, our homes, our water, and our community. The silver lining in this battle has been the wonderful new friends I've made and getting to know the amazing people in this group. It's incredible how everyone pitches in to get things done and the fun we have, even though this is a serious concern. I'd like to thank all the people who worked so hard to get this webinar set up and to the Wellington Water Watchers for hosting this event for us. Dr. Edwards, we thank you that even though it's a very busy week and you have several speaking commitments, that you're taking the time to be with us tonight. A huge thank you to you as well for all of the time, the information, and advice you've been sharing with us since the beginning of this process. It was great to hear you speak at the CLC meeting last week, and we are looking forward to learning more this evening.
Gordon Edwards is the president of the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility. He was a professor of science and human affairs at Concordia, and most importantly to us, he's been active on nuclear waste issues for 45 years. He's given numerous workshops, provided expert testimony to locations, communities, hearings, governments around the world. We're very pleased that he could be with us today. And Gordon, I invite you to turn on your microphone and your video and join us, and we'll hand it over to you. And I'll see you in 25 minutes, Gordon.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it, Mike, and welcome everybody. Thanks for this opportunity. I'm going to share my screen and try and get my slideshow started so we can not waste any time on that. Okay, excellent. I'm going to just launch into it then. Nuclear fuel waste, questions and challenges. Now, this is going to be a lot of information. I'm a teacher by profession, so I'm just going to go through it and try and explain a few things. Okay. So the first question is, what is nuclear fuel waste? What is this stuff we're talking about? Nuclear power generates energy by splitting uranium atoms. Uranium is the only material found in nature that can be used as a fuel for nuclear reactors. There are other materials that are human-made that can also be used for that purpose, such as plutonium. But plutonium is not found in nature. It's created inside every nuclear reactor as a byproduct. Now, the thing is that when you split a uranium atom, you do release a lot of energy, but you also get the broken pieces of the uranium atom. And there are hundreds of different broken pieces. They all have different names, and they're all very unstable atoms. They're radioactive poisons. And these radioactive poisons are the bulk of what we call the nuclear waste. They give off penetrating radiation that can be deadly, and they also give off non-penetrating radiation, which can be very harmful inside the body, but not outside the body. So what is radioactivity? Well, radioactivity is when you have an atom whose nucleus is unstable. It's like a little time bomb. It's going to explode suddenly and violently without any warning. And when it explodes, it gives off projectiles. It could give off a gamma ray, which is highly penetrating, much more powerful than an X-ray, and can harm you at a distance. Or it can also give off alpha or beta particles, which are less penetrating and which generally are not harmful outside the body, but which can be very harmful inside the body when they're ingested into the body. It's not the alpha or beta particles that are ingested, it's the materials which produce those alpha and beta particles. So we call them alpha emitters or beta emitters. or gamma emitters. The main thing I want you to focus on is that radiation in this sense is not some invisible ray. They're really materials. They're materials. They're the broken pieces of uranium atoms and other materials as well. Now, radioactivity is a form of nuclear energy that cannot be shut off. Nobody knows how to stop these pops from happening. The radioactive atoms are popping like popcorn, very dangerous popcorn. Imagine a popcorn machine that you just can't stop. It just keeps going and going and going, and you get more and more popcorn being produced all the time. That's what happens with radioactivity. And every pop is called a becquerel per second. When you have 1,000,000 becquerels, it means that there's 1,000,000 atoms disintegrating every single second. So a becquerel is 1 disintegration per second. And this is why we have a nuclear waste problem, because we don't know how to shut this stuff off, and it's very harmful when it's in the living environment. Now here's an ad from the nuclear industry. The actor is holding what is a simulated uranium fuel pellet, and it's called Small Wonder, this ad, because it's indicating how marvelous it is that this tiny little fuel pellet of uranium has enough energy, has as much energy as a ton of coal, and yet is much cleaner burning because you only fission the atoms. You don't produce carbon dioxide and pollute the environment with greenhouse gases. But what he doesn't tell you, and this is the thing about the nuclear industry, is they often deal in half-truths. They tell you what they want you to know, and they don't tell you what you don't want to know, what they don't want you to know. In this case, he doesn't tell you that once you've used that fuel pellet for energy, you can't throw it away. You have to keep an eye on it for the next 10 million years, because it has become very intensely radioactive, high-level radioactive waste, and that's because it contains hundreds of fission products, those broken pieces of uranium atoms. He also doesn't tell you that one of those fuel bundles in front of him on the table there, they are harmless before they go into the reactor because they're filled with uranium, but uranium gives off a non-penetrating form of radiation, the alpha radiation I mentioned. However, once they've been in there and they come back out again, they're millions of times more radioactive, and they will kill any human being in less than a minute because of a blast of gamma radiation. Now here is the face of a CANDU reactor. This is actually the Darlington reactor before it started operation. The man standing in front of the face, this shows you the size of it. And there are hundreds and hundreds, as you can see, of horizontal channels. They're called fuel channels. And those fuel channels are filled with those fuel bundles that I just showed you on the table. And that's where the fission takes place, the fissioning of those atoms. So that if this fuel had ever been used, that man would be dead, because you can't stand there. You'd be killed by the gamma radiation almost instantly. So there are two types of nuclear energy to bear in mind. One is the nuclear fission, which is the splitting of uranium atoms or plutonium atoms, but there are very few substances that can undergo nuclear fission. Most radioactive materials cannot. Radioactivity is an entirely different thing. Whereas fission can be stopped by just choking off the neutrons that cause fission, radioactivity cannot be stopped. And so we have radioactive waste, and we have a real problem if it gets into the environment. There's no way we can stop it from disintegrating and damaging living things. Now here's a list of 211 radioactive materials. Most of them were never found in nature before 1939. These are human-made radioactive materials which are created by the splitting of uranium atoms. Look at them all. And every single one of these elements has its own particular chemistry. It has its own pathways through the environment and its own pathway through the human body. They go to different organs, and they cause different kinds of problems depending on how they behave in the body. So you can understand how very complicated it is to keep track of all these radioactive materials. And this list of 211 is by no means complete. And by the way, this list is also for 10-year-old fuel. When the fuel is younger, there are even more radioactive materials, probably more than 1,000 of them. Some of them disappear rather quickly. Some of them will still be disintegrating millions of years from now. So we can't put a time limit on how long we have to look after the waste. Hundreds of thousands of years is often stated, but it needs to be much longer than that. So what happened is this irradiated fuel or used fuel is extremely dangerous. But for the first 30 years of the nuclear age, the nuclear industry didn't tell decision makers about that. They said nuclear power is clean energy. And everybody understood clean energy to mean it's really problem free, that there's really nothing to worry about. And consequently, you can just feel quite content to build these reactors and operate them and no harm done. But toward the end of the 1970s, it became apparent, not only in Canada, but in many other countries of the world, that this high-level radioactive waste, as it's called, is going to cost billions of dollars to manage, and we don't really know how to neutralize it or render it harmless. So it poses a real problem, an existential problem facing the human race, because if we can't get rid of this stuff, can't keep it out of the environment of living things, then we're in trouble. Fortunately, we do know how to package it. We do know how to keep it out of the environment. And we can repackage it as many times as necessary. So in fact, we do know how to manage it. We just don't know how to get rid of it. So in 1978 in Ontario, the Ontario Royal Commission on Electric Power Planning published a report which contained a nuclear ultimatum. Solve the waste problem if you expect your industry to survive. Because if we can't find a solution for these dangerous waste materials and get them out permanently out of the environment of living things, then we should not build any more nuclear reactors. We shouldn't continue down this path. And that same ultimatum was also being given in other countries. In Britain and in the US, similar reports were being issued with the same message. 20 years after that report, there was the Seaborn Panel report. This was a 10-year environmental assessment panel which looked into the idea that was put forward by the industry. The industry said, well, yes, we didn't tell you about the nuclear waste perhaps, but that's because we know exactly what to do with it. We're just going to bury it and underground, and then we're going to seal up the underground repository, and that's the end of it. We will get rid of it, and it won't be a problem to anybody. It certainly won't harm any living things. The only difficulty is, by the way, at that time, I was debating some of these nuclear people, and it was frequently stated by nuclear proponents that nuclear waste is not a technical problem, it's only a public relations problem. And this sort of set off alarm bells in my head, because I thought, wow, that's not a very good attitude to have towards this material. This material can kill literally millions of people, and I don't think you should just call it a public relations problem. It sort of tipped me off to the idea that there could be a real conflict of interest here. If they regard it as a public relations problem, they might not do the best things. So why is nuclear waste hard to contain? Surely these fuel bundles are metallic. They've got the ceramic fuel pellets inside. These are uranium, ceramic fuel pellets. Everything is very hard, solid, not easily dissolved. So how could radioactive materials get out? Granted, it's full of radioactive poisons, and granted, you have to keep your distance from it or it'll kill you, just at a distance from the gamma radiation. Still, the radioactive poison should stay inside, shouldn't they? Well, it turns out that when a CANDU reactor is operating, all of the fuel is in the yellow area called the reactor core. And all that red piping is what carries the boiling hot water. It's at 300 degrees Celsius. So it's superheated water, and it's carried up to the steam generator, which is a kind of a boiler up at the top there. And there's 8 of them, and every Bruce reactor has 8 steam generators. You would think that the steam generator, for example, should be completely non-radioactive. I mean, why should it be radioactive? It's not anywhere close to the fuel. It turns out that all of the piping turns out to be radioactive waste, and it can never be recycled for any other purpose. And the reason why is because these fuel bundles leak all the time. They only leak to a small degree, but the radioactive materials that are given off, dozens of radioactive materials accumulate in the pipes and in the thousands of pipes inside the steam generator, and they become quite dangerously radioactive. As a matter of fact, there were 500 workers who were contaminated, and these are not employees of Bruce Power. These are just welders and pipe fitters and people like that, tradesmen, who were working in the refurbishment of the Bruce reactor. who, for a period of 3 weeks, they were breathing plutonium-contaminated dust in the reactor vault because as they were working on the pipes, the dust was escaping from the pipes and getting into the air and getting into their lungs. And they'll carry that burden of plutonium in their lungs for the rest of their lives. So accidents do happen, and these materials do leak out, and it's all related to damage to the fuel. Any damage to the fuel, even a little pinhole or a little crack, any kind of damage at all, even slight damage, will cause radioactive releases. Here are 42 radioactive poisons which are released routinely from the operation of the Quebec reactor, the Gentil 2 reactor, which is now shut down. But while it was operating, Hydro-Quebec published this list of 42 materials, radioactive, human-made materials, which are given off into the water all the time. Eight radioactive poisons, which are given off from the radioactive waste storage area. And there are 47 other radionuclides, which I haven't included still, which are given off into the air. So these radioactive materials do find themselves, and it's all related to into the environment, and it's all related to any kind of fuel damage at all. Now, the irradiated fuel is so radioactive that it continues to generate heat. Think of that popcorn machine. The fact that these atoms are popping all the time, that's a form of energy. And that energy results in an increase of temperature, and it'll rapidly increase the temperature. When it's in the core of the reactor, it'll increase the temperature up to the melting point of uranium, and you get a meltdown. In fact, the reactors at Fukushima, the 3 meltdowns, was caused entirely by the heat from the radioactivity of the spent fuel. So you can imagine how terribly radioactive these things are. In fact, they have to cool it for 10 years at least in a deep pool at Darlington. This is the Darlington spent fuel pool. They have to cool it with circulating water for 10 years to prevent the fuel from spontaneously overheating because of its radioactivity. And also the water acts as a shield of radiation so that the workers will not get lethal doses of gamma rays standing at the surface of, standing at the top of the pool. After 10 years, they can move the fuel into a dry storage container, a dry storage cask. Now this dry storage cask, when it's empty, it weighs 60 tons. And when it's full, it weighs 70 tons. So in other words, there's only 10 tons of fuel in there. Can you imagine anything? For example, think of a refrigerator where the container for the refrigerator is 6 times as massive as the refrigerator itself. That's what we have here. And why? Because they want to take every possible precaution against letting those radioactive poisons escape into the environment. Now, some gamma radiation, even despite the thickness of this container, some gamma radiation does penetrate through to the surface. And you'll notice that at the top, there's this safeguard seal, that little red thing there. And by the way, the top is welded on. It's a very firm, solid weld. And the whole cask is filled with an inert gas so as to prevent degradation of the fuel. They don't want the fuel to be any more damaged than it already is. When the fuel comes out of the reactor, it's already distorted and has undergone a certain amount of damage. Those rods are no longer parallel. Those rods are no longer straight. They're bent to slightly bent. And the metal has been embrittled. That means that it's more prone to have leaks. The reason why the safeguard seal is on there for international inspectors, because in this cask, there are 40 kilograms of plutonium. That's enough to make 6 or 7 atomic bombs. And these flasks have to be inspected by international authorities from the International Atomic Energy Agency to verify that nobody has tampered with the cask and tried to get at the plutonium for military purposes. Of course, here in Canada, we think that's a little silly, but we had, in fact, did play a role of providing plutonium in the World War II atomic bomb project. And of course, India exploded its first atomic bomb using plutonium from a Canadian reactor. So it's a very serious problem worldwide. Now, when they want to move the spent fuel, they put it into a much less massive cask, which is called a shipping container. And the shipping container, you notice that those fuel modules with 96 fuel bundles all bundled together, they lower it. I forgot to mention that when they fill the dry storage cask, they have to do it underwater to prevent radiation from escaping and to prevent gamma radiation from damaging the workers. in this case, when they move it into a transport thing, they have to use something called a hot cell, which we'll talk about in a minute. Then they put it on a truck, and the truck carries it. By the way, that truck is also equipped with a bed for an alternate driver to catch 40 winks, because they don't want to have to stop if they can help it, because there is gamma radiation coming off from that package, and it will irradiate people in the cars passing by, people in the houses living along the transportation route. And if they were to stop for to take a leak, for example, they could maybe give people an unnecessarily high dose of radiation. So they try to keep moving and have an extra bed for an alternate driver. When they get to the destination, which is going to be, for example, Teeswater, if Teeswater was chosen as the willing host community, they don't just put that stuff directly underground. They have to unpack it and repackage it. And because it's so radioactive, they have to do this in very specialized equipment called hot cells. And these hot cells are designed for handling extremely radioactive material that would be deadly for workers to handle without thick protection. So they have glass that is leaded glass, and it's, in this case, it's 3 feet thick. Actually, it's 6 feet thick. That's a mistake, 3 feet thick. It should be 6 feet thick, leaded glass. And they have 2 remote manipulators. That means that the fuel bundles cannot be handled by anything but robotic equipment. However, in this case, the workers can manipulate the remote arm, sort of like the Canadarm, in order to put the fuel into another container, which is to go underground. And this container is a steel container. You notice how tightly packed those fuel bundles are. It's going to be difficult to pack that in with robotic equipment without damaging the fuel more than it's already damaged, because it's not straight anymore. As I mentioned, it is always distorted. And so fitting it into that tight space, into that tight container, will probably result in more damage. They will be processing about 300 bundles a day by remote control for 30 to 60 years. So, and I'm talking here about 365 days a year. So in all that time, there's bound to be accidents, there's bound to be releases. I don't know of any place on Earth where they have hot cells where they don't also have off-site contamination. Usually these places are located in places where there's considerable off-site contamination. And the thickness of the copper they use here is only 3 millimeters. That's only to protect the steel, because they know the steel would corrode rather quickly if they put it underground. But evidence has now shown that the copper will also corrode. And once the copper corrodes, the steel will corrode even faster with the copper coating on it. In January of 2018, the Swedish Environmental Court said no to the final repository for used nuclear fuel in Sweden because of copper corrosion questions. They found that there were 5 different mechanisms of copper corrosion in the absence of oxygen that the industry had not properly answered. Now, both the industry in Canada and the industry in Sweden, they both assumed that copper would not corrode in the absence of oxygen, because once you seal the repository, there shouldn't be any oxygen there after a while. But they've discovered there are various mechanisms for copper corrosion that don't require oxygen. So why is nuclear waste so dangerous? Well, the main reason, of course, is these radioactive emissions called atomic radiation. Alpha, beta, and gamma. Alpha and beta are less penetrating than gamma. Consequently, alpha and beta are primarily internal hazards. When they get into the food chain, the materials that give off alpha radiation, beta radiation, can be very damaging. The U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission pointed out that high-level waste, that means the used fuel, produces fatal radiation doses during short periods of direct exposure. That's why they have to use the hot cells to manipulate them. Even 10 years after removal from a reactor, the surface dose rate is far greater than the fatal whole body dose for humans. But if isotopes from these high-level wastes get into groundwater, so what we're talking about here now is leakage of materials out of the waste. If they leak into the groundwater, they may then enter the food chain, and the dose that people get from that would be much smaller and would not cause any direct fatalities. But in such a case, you get a much larger population exposed, and in that case, what you find is an increase of cancer and various other diseases, which normally show up later. What scientific evidence has revealed is that chronic exposure to low levels of atomic radiation and these radioactive materials can increase the incidence of cancer, leukemia, genetic damage. That means the damage to the reproductive cells of men and women, eggs and sperm, strokes, heart attacks, and also low intelligence in unborn children. If unborn children are exposed to radioactive materials in the womb, which would be transmitted by the placenta across the placenta from the mother. But there is a latency period for these illnesses. The onset of disease occurs years or decades after exposure. It's not a question of getting exposed today and feeling over dead the next day. That's not the way it works. It's a slower process. Now, these fission products are chemical substances which are also radioactive, and they go to different parts of the body depending upon the chemistry. So, for example, iodine-131, just like normal iodine, goes to the thyroid gland. They have iodized salt. You know, if you look at your salt shaker, it has iodized salt. They put iodine in the salt so that it will go to the thyroid gland and prevent a disease called goiter. It's preventative medicine. But radioactive thyroid will also go to the thyroid gland, and it will also prevent goiter, but it will irradiate the thyroid, and 5,000 children in Belarus had to have their thyroid glands surgically removed because of iodine-131 exposures following the Chernobyl accident. Now, there won't be any iodine-131 in the old fuel, 50 years old, that comes up to Teeswater, for example. But there is another radioactive iodine called iodine-129, which has a multi-million-year half-life. And it will be there, and it will also be a vapor, and it could also very easily escape. And it could contaminate the milk. That's how it gets to the children usually, is contaminating the cow's milk. And then it concentrates in the cow's milk, and then it reconcentrates even more so in the child's thyroid gland. Now, strontium-90, for example, is another material, and it behaves differently. It's more like calcium. So it goes to the bones, the teeth, and mother's milk, and it causes things like bone cancer and leukemia. So different radioactive materials cause different kinds of medical damage because of where they go in the body. At low levels of exposure, harmful biological effects like cancer do not occur until many years after exposure. As I mentioned, radioactive materials, these red dots, enter into the air, the water, the soil. They get into the fish, the plants, the animals, and humans. They tend to concentrate as they go up the food chain. And a small fraction of the population will develop cancer caused by the radiation exposure. Infants and children are especially vulnerable. And by the way, women are almost twice as vulnerable as men to radiation onset from cancer, from radiation exposure. Cancer onset, I mean. If a larger population is exposed to the same level of contamination, you say that the population dose is greater. And then you get more people having cancer. So even with the same level of contamination, you're going to get more cancers if there's more people. Now, another danger that is particularly troublesome is plutonium, which I already mentioned once. This is a book that I reviewed just this year. It was written last year, called Plutonium: How Nuclear Power's Dream Fuel Became a Nightmare. The creation of plutonium inside a nuclear reactor happens when a neutron hits a uranium atom and does not split, but turns into a heavier element called plutonium-239. And that's where the plutonium comes from, by uranium atoms absorbing neutrons and getting heavier. This is a glass paperweight, which is the exact size of the plutonium that was used in the Nagasaki bomb. That's how much plutonium you need to destroy a city. It's about 6.2 kilograms. And as I mentioned, one of those dry storage containers will be enough for 6 or 7 Nagasaki-type bombs. So how many bombs are there in the CANDU used fuel? Well, there's about 50,000 tons. The amount of plutonium in there would be around 200 tons of plutonium. And today, that would be enough to build 32,000 atomic bombs. That's those 200 tons at the rate of 6.2 kilograms per bomb. If you wait 24,000 years, which is the half-life of plutonium, that's how long it takes for half of the plutonium to disintegrate, then you have only 100 tons and you'd be able to build 16,000 bombs. After 48,000 years, you have half again. And after 96,000 years, you'd still have enough for 2,000 bombs. So this is a great concern, because anybody who digs up the spent fuel after it's been buried underground could have enough plutonium to make an awful lot of doomsday weapons. Plutonium is also dangerous as a radioactive poison. A few thousandths of a gram of plutonium, that's barely visible, inhaled will cause death in a few weeks due to massive fibrosis of the lungs. And a few millionths of a gram of plutonium, that's an invisible amount, will cause lung cancer 20 or 30 years after exposure. That comes from a United Kingdom Royal Commission report on nuclear energy and the environment. So if you look at the plutonium toxicity, it turns out the maximum allowed exposure for an atomic worker is 0.7 micrograms. This is because we have atomic workers who work with nuclear weapons. So they have to work with plutonium. Now, 200 tons of plutonium would be enough to overdose 285 trillion workers, which is of course absurd, but it just shows you how dangerous it is. After 240,000 years, that's 10 times the half-life. 10 times the half-life reduces the amount of material by a factor of 1,000. So it goes from 200 tons to 200 kilograms. And that would be enough to overdose 285 billion workers, and so on and on and on it goes. After almost 1 million years, there'd still be enough to overdose 285 workers. So again, the toxicity is enormous as well.
Hi, Gordon.
Yeah, 5
We're
minutes?
we're at the half-hour mark.
Oh, we are. Okay, so should I keep going for 5 minutes or should I stop?
No, keep going. I'm just giving you a heads up.
Okay, so why is a DGR the wrong solution? Well, frankly, in my opinion, it's because we do not have a solution. The DGR is the wrong solution because any solution is the wrong solution if we think of it as a permanent solution. I don't think we have a solution to this problem. The human race has never disposed of anything. And with geological disposal, they've already said, NWMO, that they're not going to put any waste underground until it's 50 years old above ground. Well, if it's 50 years old above ground, that means that the amount of waste above ground is never going to get much shorter because there's always going to be a lot there, and the catastrophe potential is unchanged. So there's another reason, however, for moving the fuel, and that is to try and get the plutonium out of the fuel to be used as fuel for new reactors. Because anything that can be used for atomic bombs can also be used as fuel for nuclear reactors. And this is called reprocessing. And where they've done reprocessing, anywhere in the world, are among the most radioactively contaminated sites anywhere you'll find. But it's clear that Atomic Energy of Canada Limited would like eventually to be able to use this plutonium to keep the nuclear industry going. In fact, in 2008, there was a mural painted on the walls of the Saskatoon airport. And the last panel on the mural said, reprocessing and storage are the final stages of the nuclear fuel cycle. What they're saying here is that there's no point in burying the waste until you first of all get the plutonium out. But if you're going to get the plutonium out, you have to liquefy the fuel bundles. And when you liquefy the fuel bundles, you release a lot of radioactive material into the atmosphere, gases and vapors, and also into the soil as liquid. And you have a terrible situation. You have to be very careful that somebody who agrees to be a willing host community for waste storage might not end up being also the site for a plutonium reprocessing plant, which is universally acknowledged to be the dirtiest and most dangerous part of the whole nuclear fuel enterprise. So I'm going to wind it up because we're running out of time here. I'll just tell you that in 1978, the Ontario Royal Commission on Electric Power Planning was very concerned about this, and it said all spent fuel should be stored at nuclear generating station sites. A central facility would presuppose the reprocessing of spent fuel. What they're saying is that bringing all the fuel to one spot would automatically make it much easier for the industry to justify building a reprocessing plant to extract plutonium. All right, so I'm going to stop now, and thank you very much for listening. There's one final quote that I can't resist saying. This is an unsolved problem. Talking about radioactive waste, Nobel Prize-winning physicist Hannes Alfvén of Sweden said, if a problem is too difficult to solve, you cannot claim it is solved by pointing to all the efforts made to solve it. Thank you.
Thank you, Gordon. There are some questions in the Q&A box, and we're also getting some questions over Facebook. So I'm going to start off at the top of the list here. Gordon, is Fukushima still pouring radioactive isotopes into the atmosphere and the Pacific Ocean?
They certainly are. It's still pouring isotopes into the Pacific Ocean for sure. How much of it is going into the atmosphere is, to my knowledge, I haven't heard any specific reports. But one of the reasons they have 800,000 tons of water they want to dump, contaminated water they want to dump into the ocean, is because they have to keep on cooling those melted cores that have melted down into the ground. They have to pump 400 tons of water a day down into those melted cores and then pump it back up to the surface again in order to keep the cores from overheating once more. As I told you, you need to cool this fuel for about 10 years. And it's only been 9 years since the Fukushima accident. So they're still putting water down there and flushing it back up to the top. And some of that water is going into the Pacific Ocean every day.
There's a question about the Connectrix laundry, and I'm not sure if you know enough, what you know about this, Gordon, but I'll read the question to you and then you can see what you say. At the Connectrix laundry in Teeswater, they're planning to boil off tired wastewater. The radionuclides from that water will go back to where they came from, like Darlington, Pickering, or Bruce. How is this possible? Would you please comment on this? This was discussed at an August 11th Council Connectrix delegation.
Okay, well, I don't know the specifics of that particular plan, but they often want to reduce the volume of material containing radioactivity. If, for example, the water was not radioactive itself, which it probably is, but if the water were not radioactive, then you could imagine boiling off the water or evaporating the water and leaving a residue behind, which is most of the radioactivity. And then you could ship that radioactivity to another site for storage, and it would be much reduced in volume. However, I believe that the water would also be radioactive, and consequently, you would be dispersing some of the radioactivity into the atmosphere. Certainly when they have an incinerator at Bruce, and when they incinerate things, they do give a lot of radioactive material into the environment, even though that's not their intention. Their intention is to reduce the volume of the radioactive material they're burning, so that the ashes contain most of the radioactivity, but some of it does go right up into the air.
Thank you. Dr. Edwards, last week you spoke about radiation dose while transporting the nuclear fuel bundles. What dose is estimated coming off the transport container? How does that compare to the cobalt-60 that is shipped today?
Well, again, those are quantitative questions, which in order to know those answers, I would have to know what the industry is planning. Because the industry is always doing a cost-benefit analysis. They say, how much do we consider to be acceptable to expose people to? Because we're going to have to spend more and more and more money if we make the container bigger and bigger and bigger and heavier. So there's a trade-off that the industry goes through where they say, well, you know, we'll expose them to this much radiation. We'll consider that acceptable. Of course, they're not telling those people that they're being exposed, and they're not asking them whether they want to be exposed. They're just deciding for, in other words, the people who are doing the exposures are deciding how much radiation they're going to consider acceptable for the people receiving the radiation. And that is a problematic thing. Why shouldn't there be much more public discussion about what is acceptable in that regard? But the industry is often left to its own resources in that way, in that they decide along with the regulator as to what is they consider acceptable.
Gordon, you mentioned popcorn earlier, and we're popcorning a lot of questions at you, and we appreciate how quickly and you're responding to them. I've got another one question here for you from Facebook. If a DGR would be monitored and not abandoned for the same duration of time as a rolling stewardship, would the DGR provide added levels of safety over a rolling stewardship from catastrophic events?
That's quite possibly true, but also quite possibly not true, depending upon how things are done. For example, right now, the DGR at Bruce by NWMO they're using a vertical shaft, which raises lots of difficulties or problems connected with impacts, accidents involving dropping things, for example. If you contaminate the shaft, then you have a real problem getting things back up the shaft. Now, in Sweden and Norway, Sweden and Finland, they don't use a vertical shaft. They use a winding, gently sloping, winding driveway down underground, coiling around and going underground that way. And they can drive trucks and buses all the way down. And this provides, so there are many different things that can be done or not done that would make the situation safer or less safer. The difficulty with the deep geological repositories is that, first of all, we've had anyone that has so far been tried, nuclear waste deep geological repository, has had some pretty horrendous failures. The most noticeable one being in Germany, where they're now spending almost 6 billion Canadian dollars to get out the radioactive waste they put down there. And it's going to take them 30 years to do it and cost an awful lot of money. And when they get it back up on the surface, they don't yet have a plan for what to do with it then. So putting it underground may be better in some circumstances and not in others. I'm afraid that the industry, however, has a pretty much a fixated view that they want to be able to wash their hands of this. They want to be able to say a scientific Hail Mary and then walk away and say, now it's not our problem anymore, somebody else's problem.
Thank you, Gordon. There's a question here. Please have Dr. Edwards explain the NWMO involvement.
The NWMO involvement is that when they did 15 years of research costing $750 million, including the building of an underground research laboratory in Manitoba that was about 500 meters down in a granite pluton to try and discover scientific evidence that geological disposal may be acceptable. They then did a 10-year environmental assessment of this, and the panel, there was I'm not sure how many people, there were almost a dozen people on the panel, I think, maybe 8. And they came up with a unanimous recommendation that going forward, there should be an independent waste management agency, which is not tied to the nuclear industry, to look after the waste in the best possible way. What we have, unfortunately, is the Chrétien government did exactly the opposite. They created the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, which is owned entirely by the nuclear waste producers. And consequently, they're not inclined to tell the whole truth. For example, I was quite shocked to discover that some of the CLC members at South Bruce, who had been members of the CLC for 6 or 7 years, had never heard of these radioactive materials like radioactive iodine and radioactive strontium and radioactive cesium. Well, that means that NWMO is simply not telling them the necessary information. They're not telling them the truth. Why are they withholding that information? That's fundamental knowledge for anybody who wants to understand radioactive waste. Also, I found out that even people who had been on the committee for 6 or 7 years had never heard of these hot cells. Well, that's criminal, because that's, of course, the major impact on the local environment is going to be handling these fuel bundles individually and repackaging them in a much tighter container. Surely that's something which they should have known about years ago when they're even considering being a willing host community. So the problem with having NWMO in charge of this is NWMO is just basically a branch plant of OPG, and consequently they're basically seeing themselves in the role. And I don't mean this I don't mean to disparage their character, because I think they think they're doing a good job, and in many ways they are doing a good job. But they see their job as a question of reassuring people, telling them everything is going to be okay, everything's going to be safe, and then just simply selling it. So they're salesmen basically. And just like salesmen who sell medications to doctors without telling them what the nasty side effects might be, they're telling them all the benefits of this medication, but they're not telling them what the nasty parts might be. That's where I think the NWMO is the wrong agency to be in charge of this.
Thank you, Gordon. I'm going to ask you 3 more questions, and then we're going to switch to our other speaker. And so this question is very specific. If someone's home is along the transportation route, will they be exposed to gamma radiation regularly as 2 trucks a day drive by?
Yes, they will. And I'm sure the industry would say that will be negligible. If the truck, now one thing that they do have is they have a provision for accidents. If there was an accident, for example, where one of these trucks tipped over, you have to realize that the fuel inside, any damage to the fuel results in radiation releases. In fact, the lid of the container, when they take the lid off, they're going to have to spend hours decontaminating it because it's going to be coated with all kinds of radioactive materials that came out of the damaged fuel inside. If there was an accident where it actually tipped over, they have provision for an 85-ton crane to be moving at the speed of 85 kilometers per hour to get to the site of the accident within 48 hours. Well, of course, during that period of time, anybody in the area could be exposed to radiation levels over an extended period of time, and they may not be aware that this is a problem. Now, of course, you might think that they would evacuate the area, but will they? We don't know. Do the first responders even know what they're dealing with? That's questionable as well. I have concrete evidence of shipments of radioactive waste where the first responders have been given complete misinformation as to the nature of the radioactive material. 4 orders of magnitude less radioactivity than is actually the case. So the first responders are not always knowledgeable about what they're dealing with. But yes, even passing by, there would be a chronic repeated exposure going on for 30 to 60 years.
Dr. Edwards, if you lived in South Bruce, what would be your #1 concern related to the construction of a DGR?
Well, I think my #1 concern would be the danger of getting a reprocessing plant. I think that trumps everything else because those are very, very nasty operations. If you just Google Hanford, Washington, or Sellafield, UK, or Mayak, Russia, or La Hague, France, you'll see that these sites are heavily contaminated, and they've contaminated the surroundings for hundreds of kilometers around them. So the idea of having a reprocessing plant would be my #1 concern. My #2 concern would be the handling, the unnecessary handling of all these fuel bundles, because the more you handle them, the older they get, and the more you handle them, the more damage you're going to do to them. And with robotic equipment, you can easily, for example, in the Bruce reactor, they crushed a fuel bundle, a spent fuel bundle, by the refueling machine. And the crushed material went through all the piping and ended up everywhere in the primary cooling system. So these accidents, when they happen, they have long-lasting exposures resulting from that one accident. And I would be very concerned about all this unnecessary handling of used fuel bundles. If you were to just use rolling stewardship, you could just transfer them from one of those dry casks to another dry cask without ever touching the individual fuel bundles. You could list them out in a bank of 96 and put them into a new one in a bank of 96 without having to do this unnecessary manipulation. And certainly not where there are farms and dairy cattle and children around.
A couple more questions, Gordon. You referenced a book in your presentation, and somebody has asked, what is the name of this book, of his book again, please?
It's called Plutonium: How the Nuclear Industry's Dream Fuel Became a Nightmare. And I wrote a review for this book. It's a very good book. I wrote a review for this book that was published in Peace Magazine just this year. I could send a link to that review if people, because in the review I explain the technical basis for what the book is all about.
That'd be great, Gordon. And a little later, when we shift over to Marty, if you're able to send that link to Danny or Megan, we can post it in the chat box for everybody.
Oh, absolutely. Okay.
And
also, you could give my email address. Anybody is welcome to get on my mailing list. I send out mailings on nuclear issues quite regularly, and there's no charge. And I could put anybody who wants to be on my mailing list.
Super. Another question here, is Saugeen Ojibwe Nation involved in this process?
Well, the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation has, of course, unceded territory, which includes the territory that the original OPG deep geological repository was planned for at Kincardine, but which also includes the Teeswater site as well. So I believe that NWMO has already indicated that they would not proceed without the consent of the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation. And the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation is, as you know, earlier this year, I think it was January of this year, January 31st, there was a vote by the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation, and it was something like 86% against. So, and that was despite the fact that Ontario Power Generation offered them $130 million to say yes.
Okay, Gordon, we're almost near the end. Here's a very short question. I don't know how long the answer is, but the question is this: explain transmutation.
Oh, transmutation simply means that it sort of goes back to the days of alchemy. It's converting one element into a different element. And this happens all the time in nuclear reactors. For example, the neutrons that are given off, that are flying around, that are used to split the uranium atoms, they're very penetrating, and they go deep into the steel and concrete structures around the core of the reactor. And whenever that neutron strikes a non-radioactive atom, it can be absorbed by that atom and destabilize the atom and turn it into a radioactive one. So for example, cobalt-59, which exists in nature and which is not radioactive, when it absorbs a neutron, it becomes very radioactive cobalt-60. And cobalt-60 gives off an extremely penetrating gamma radiation, can be very harmful. And in fact, that's a real hazard for the workers in a nuclear plant, the cobalt-60. But it's important to realize that in this case, cobalt-60 is not a fission product. It's not a broken piece of a uranium atom. It's a non-radioactive it's a non-radioactive atom that has become radioactive because of the influence of the neutron, because of absorbing a neutron. So that's transmutation. Everybody probably has heard of tritium. Tritium is radioactive hydrogen. Now, a small amount of tritium does exist in nature, but in a CANDU reactor, all the water in the core of the reactor, there's tons and tons and tons and tons of water. It's heavy water. It's non-radioactive. But because of the neutrons that are flying around, the non-radioactive hydrogen becomes radioactive hydrogen, and that's called tritium. And so we produce more tritium than any other reactor in the world. And certainly at Bruce, there would be an enormous amount of tritium produced. And the amount of tritium keeps growing year by year, because this year's tritium is added to next year's tritium, which is added to the following year's tritium. And so the inventory keeps growing until it reaches what's called an equilibrium. But that's what transmutation is about.
Gordon, this last question might turn out to be a rhetorical question. You can decide it once you hear it, whether you want to answer it or not. And it does create a nice segue to the presentation from Marty in just a moment. And the question starts off with a statement. At the Bruce County Museum, a display about the nuclear industry in the early days of the Douglas Point site, a newspaper article stated only 4 or 5 people would be required to operate the system. Clearly, they were very optimistic or untruthful. Is it possible they would be untruthful again regarding the DGR?
Well, I think the evidence is clear that they are being untruthful about the DGR. I was quite shocked, really, to find out that members of the CLC, I can understand some of the farmers in the community, somebody who just lives there and hasn't paid much attention, not knowing what fission products are. But to understand that the CLC members who have been meeting regularly with NWMO representatives for 6 years on a monthly basis still don't know that there are radioactive materials in the spent fuel. They're obviously being treated like unfairly. They're really being treated like dupes, and it's really a shame and a scandal. And I think that it should be brought to the attention of the authorities.